something you should do at least on a quarterly basis is sit down and do, a walk along with a sales rep, with a marketer. And it's silly, you may be remote, so not necessarily sitting side by side, but actually sit on their calls, watch the motion, hear what they're talking about, what conversations they're having with customers, and really see what their day-to-day looks like. I don't think that happens often enough.
Welcome to RevOps Rockstars, in pursuit of unicorns. I'm David Carnes.
And I'm Jarin Chu. Join us as we interview RevOps leaders to explore the challenges they have faced, the biggest lessons they've learned, and what they think makes a RevOps rockstar.
This show is brought to you by OpFocus, on a mission to help companies run their businesses better by letting you focus on growth while we scale your operations. Let's get this show on the road.
Today's guest is our newest RevOps rockstar, an expert in both quantitative and qualitative analytics, specializing in translating raw data and actionable insights. She's led marketing and revenue ops teams for over 8 years. Most recently was the head of global revenue marketing and operations at HYCU. Samantha Richey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be on today.
Yeah, we're so happy to have you. You know, we love asking a tough question to start with. And, you know, this provides such a great learning opportunity for our listeners. Samantha, what's something in RevOps that you had to learn the hard way?
I think the hardest thing to learn is that while you may have an idea that's brilliant in theory, the practical application may not always turn out the way that you expected. And you have to be willing to adjust and be agile and flexible, especially as you're getting user feedback. A lot of times, worked great in testing, worked great in staging. And then when we roll it out into production, there's unintended consequences, be that with the users themselves, other business processes, or other tech that might have been impacted. So again, you kind of have to keep things not personal. So again, it's a reality I think we've all learned at some point.
So you're saying like keep the ego at the door and then
ego at the door. Yep.
Are you seeking out that kind of feedback in a formal way, or are you just receptive to it after the launch, or both?
I think you have to do both. It's important, I think, us as ops professionals, that user feedback is critical for us. So you have to be methodical and collect that on a regular basis. You have to watch the data, but you have to have real conversations, both with marketers and with the sales team, to see, practical application, what they're really talking about. You're going to get different opinions from sales leadership or marketing leadership than you will from, the everyday users who are actually using your systems, using your business processes, using the technology that you've implemented. So it's important to hear from everybody on what their experiences are so that you can continuously improve as you're going.
I'm interested in learning a bit about the RevOps roles that you've been in. You've been in both marketing ops in your past. You've been in the revenue ops side. Most recently, as the head of global revenue marketing and operations at HYCU, what did that entail?
Yeah, so on the ops side, we oversaw both marketing operations and sales operations. So, our version of RevOps was that combined function, which was really great. It helped us to create a lot of scale and efficiencies that I don't think you see when marketing ops and sales ops are siloed from each other. And helped us actually to put, better business processes in place faster. So that's this kind of evolution and shift away from, having two separate siloed organizations into this new kind of RevOps model. I think that's why a lot of businesses are moving towards it. It really allows that alignment between two core functions of your business to happen more organically without some of the head-to-head that you typically see between sales and marketing. Not to say that doesn't exist, but having an aligned operations organization, I think, really helps to mitigate some of that.
I want to dive a little bit deeper into that because a lot of times I think in the marketing community, CMO community, we hear a lot about how marketing ops and sales ops need to be separate because it's a longer term view in marketing ops versus a shorter term view in sales ops. As someone with marketing ops background and inhabiting a role where you did oversee both, personally, did you find it challenging or difficult to balance or negotiate the demands of both the short-term requirements of ops and then the longer-term, more strategic aspects of ops?
Again, I'm strongly in the camp that I think it's the best model to have them together because you're able to hear both sides. Again, as you mentioned, both sides have very different needs. Marketing is typically looking for more visibility into their programs. They may want more depth in the waterfall so that they can kind of see, different stages than you're going to necessarily want from the sales users. But, then sales leadership is looking for kind of that bottom end of the funnel, the outcomes, time to close, all of those things. So hearing both sides is really helpful. And then it's your job really to put that together and prioritize and explain to users on both ends why you're going one way versus another in terms of prioritization of your roadmap. But ultimately, again, I think once you see the strength of having the combined RevOps org, it really just makes sense. I don't think, a lot of times what I find is you may get direction from, one side, and they'll come and tell you, well, I need this new field because of what, X, Y, Z. And some, organization will just say, okay, we'll take that order, create the field without asking what they were actually trying to achieve. When you have that combined RevOps functions, instead of one team going out and just, creating their own environment and the other team creating, their environment, you're able to kind of have that more strategic conversation around what is the goal here? What outcome are you looking for? Because most likely there's another way to get there that's going to satisfy both sides. And I think that's one thing when you have it totally separate and siloed that most people don't see. Everyone's moving in the same direction. How we get there and how we get there together is what's ultimately going to drive our success.
Yeah, I hear you on the alignment, especially. And I think what you're calling out is the responsibility as the leader of that function to not let more of the strategic components of operations or the short-term, long-term approach of marketing versus sales ops dictate all of what you do. Like you're the traffic cop or you're the tiebreaker and needing to protect time to be able to still focus on those longer term pieces. You're
protecting time not only for your team, but for the business as a whole. It's very easy to go down the rabbit hole, chasing requests. But again, if you as a leader are not focused on ultimately what are we trying to accomplish? What is the outcome? Is it a new capability that we're trying to stand up? Is it a level of efficiency that we're trying to create? If you're not pushing back and being the one who's dictating that strategy, everyone ends up just wasting time. And a lot of times when you come into a new environment, you'll see, you've got, fields across your CRM and your automation platforms that haven't been touched in years. And then, you've got duplicates and there's a lot of cleanup that typically has to happen because someone didn't ask the hard questions and someone didn't push back. So the other really key piece is as an ops leader, communicating back to marketing and sales leadership around why you're making those changes. Again, the other challenge with operations is sometimes to get to one new capability, there may be 3 sequential steps we have to take. Step 1 in isolation may not make sense to a sales leader or marketing leader. It's your role and responsibility to explain to them why we're doing this now and what it's ultimately going to achieve for them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You've also worked in a lot of different sized segments and companies. I suspect RevOps as a function looks very different from segment to segment. Could you give me a few of those like takeaways and highlights of what surprised you?
Yeah, so I've actually been at companies of all sizes, from small startup, hyper growth, mid-sized startup to Fortune 500. Obviously when you're in the corporate Fortune 500 space, you have a lot more resources typically. You've got, probably your own in-house developers, even some that are specific to platforms. You might have your own Salesforce dev team and, a full suite of IT professionals who are there to kind of help you through working. And then, when you're in the small startup side, you might have one person who's your admin for all of your platforms, and they're, responsible for Salesforce, for your marketing automation, for any of your webinar platforms, your ad tech, all of it. So working within, the confines of your own team is really key. And I think most people, and traditionally, are more on the smaller side. I think only really in the last couple of years, in the last decade or so, we're starting to see ops teams kind of scale up and grow at a faster pace than they have previously. So most of the time, you're working with relatively limited resources and having to make a case a lot of where you need additional help. So it's important to make sure you kind of have your critical functions covered first. So your critical tech, you want to make sure you have that admin. And where you start to get into other platforms, that's where you start to think of if we need either internal headcount or agency resources to help support. So again, you're looking at most of the time limited resources and a lack of understanding, I think, across the board, a lot of times, of what ops does and why we need more people. So having to learn how to make a business case too, again, and have that conversation with your leaders around what's going on in the organization, what you're doing, what your team is working on. It's important to make sure that in the future, when you're doing annual planning, you have a seat at the table to make sure you get what you need for the new year.
And I love how you're thinking about resourcing. We're definitely going to come back to that in a few moments, how you build the team, et cetera. Before we move off of the topic around like your experience as a RevOps leader in different size companies, I'm interested in whether there's specific examples as you reflect back of things that you wish you did sooner in your role when you started.
Things I wish I did sooner. That one's tough. It's depending on the company and what stage you are from maturity perspective. I think there's a lot of things. I always start with, kind of month one, diving into the data. I'm never making changes right away when I'm starting with a new team. You have to first understand really what's going on. What does your existing environment look like? What do your SKUs look like? What is your go-to-market motion? You can't just dive in and start making changes. So I guess, to answer that, what do I wish I did sooner? Sometimes I wish I waited a little more before starting to implement, big changes. Again, you really want to understand, especially on the ops side, what's going on, why things were done a certain way before you start trying to reinvent the wheel.
I suspect that data collection also isn't limited to looking into the system, but also spending time with actual users, actual folks that would be impacted by those systems.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing people should always do, and not a one and done type of deal, but something you should do at least on a quarterly basis, is sit down and do, a walk along with a sales rep, with a marketer. And it's silly, you may be remote, so not necessarily sitting side by side, but actually sit on their calls, watch the motion, hear what they're talking about, what conversations they're having with customers, and really see what their day-to-day looks like. I don't think that happens often enough. And a lot of times, when you're dealing with, your clients, on the ops side, your clients are sales and marketing, realistically. They may not necessarily have the vocabulary to know what it is that they really need. They know that they have a problem, or there's a point of frustration in, whatever they're doing throughout the day. You might see things, in that, shadowing experience that you might not have otherwise heard about. So doing that on a regular basis, I think, is really critical beyond just having, the conversations where you're actively seeking feedback.
Right. And I think the underlying principle you're also maybe referencing is trust but validate, right? Your leaders, your other functional heads might tell you a certain understanding of their team or their processes, but riding along, sitting next to a rep, going through their day together, that's really where you understand what actually happens.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's so important. So you described earlier that you have at HYCU, you had sales and marketing operations together. Were there other functions that RevOps owned within the business?
Yeah. So analytics was in there as well. So again, really key component, I think, when you're looking at RevOps is that analytics and a reporting function. Now, sometimes, again, depending on the organization size, that may be separate. Sometimes it lives in the finance organization. Sometimes it's its own kind of beast under some type of BI team. But again, if we're talking, startup world, it may not even be a function. That just may be part of someone's job on a small ops team. It's like, okay, and you do all of our reporting.
So HYCU's about 300 people, Series C last year, which was very exciting.
Series B.
Tell us. Oh, Series B. Oh, okay. How did you structure the team specifically? The various headcount on the team.
Yeah, so we had a director that was over the team, as well as then kind of the three core functions, each with a manager leading them. One for the marketing ops piece, one specific for sales ops. That ran deal desk and your typical sales operations functions, and then analytics kind of as the third piece there.
And how did you determine the right balance of in-house versus outsourced help to go achieve your strategies?
So when I had first joined, the team was relatively small. So, we brought on contract and agency resources initially. So, and I think that's a pretty valid strategy for a lot of organizations as you're trying to scale up. Start external. It gives you access to more resources, more diverse resources. And then as you hit critical mass, that's when you start to bring in-house talent. So, I think initially, I want to say it was probably like 3 or 4 people. And then over time, got up to, I want to say close to 15, just in the function. So it's about figuring out when and where is the right time to bring on an internal resource, once you hit that scale.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And that's quite a bit of growth that you went through. That's very exciting.
Yes.
As a high-performing ops team, I think a lot of ops leaders tell us how they end up taking on a lot of initiatives that are maybe not traditionally in the ops function. They're kind of the folks who take the lead on anything the company needs where it doesn't fit cleanly into anywhere. I'm interested in whether there's some interesting corporate level cross-functional initiatives that you helped own or drive in the past that is kind of outside of the traditional purview of what you would consider RevOps.
Yeah. So in my NCR days, there was a period, back where we decided to make a pretty drastic move into zero-based budgeting. So again, really certainly not marketing ops initiative at all. Really more of a finance initiative than anything else. But because so much of it was involved with data management, there was a lot of cleanup that had to be done, to make sure that we could track the different packages the way we wanted to and really report out on the suspend. I ended up managing 2 of the largest packages across the company. Again, it was that exact scenario. It doesn't really cleanly fit into ops, but was happy to volunteer. It was a big initiative. There was some crossover. So it ended up being a really positive experience.
Wow, that really is stretching the capabilities of ops. And I know also what's interesting is a lot of ops functions in companies, I've actually started seeing a lot more rolling back up to finance. So what you're describing, as ops evolves and expands and becomes this amorphous, adaptable mass, I'm guessing people would probably see more of that if they had the finance aptitude that initiatives like what you just described might be rolled up. For sure. There.
And I think I ironically think it is in a lot of cases a pretty natural fit, especially when you have a forward-thinking CFO. So a lot of times, at least in past lives for me, I've had to sell, my CFO on marketing being a revenue center as opposed to a cost center. But, when you have a CFO who's already bought in, you kind of open up this whole new world of possibilities in terms of being able to model out your revenue all the way from the top of funnel and your leading indicators that you don't get when you're trying to kind of fight that battle of like, no, we're not just a cost here. Like we are able to generate revenue and here's how we're defining it and kind of aligning across those common definitions. And then it really helps the finance team drive forward when you're trying to set up your data architecture ultimately to report out in a certain way. Let's just kind of use the example, let's say you have a mixed model hardware versus software business. If you don't necessarily have the data to report out on what revenue is coming from which area, it's something that has to be set up. And your CFO is going to be very, very much involved in that piece of the conversation. So having that alignment from the beginning is really great.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I want to take advantage and I'm eager to dive deeper into that kind of multi-segment experience you've had, different size companies, different types of funding backgrounds. You've been at VC-backed startups, you've been in public companies. When you're interacting with even more senior level folks, you mentioned the CFO earlier, but further than that, it's the board and investors, right? That everyone is really accountable to. How has it been different and how have you interacted with board and investors at these different types of company stages?
Yeah, so it is very, very different, when you're talking VC-backed startup versus, public company. I think that's important, especially from the ops side to keep in mind on who it is you're talking to. On the public company, depending on what level you're at, you may not necessarily be interacting directly with board members. You may be, though, helping your exec perhaps prepare for a board meeting. In that, public company space, what they're looking for, is that accurate reporting, what happened in the quarter, making sure that any numbers you're presenting, there's, the appendix backed up of, here's how we got these calculations, here's how everything is defined. It's a very different conversation than when you're in the VC environment. When you're in a startup, the board members have a different interest in helping you. So they're really there to make sure you succeed. Most likely your company is part of their portfolio because they have experience with other companies like yours. So they want to help you solve challenges. They've been there before, likely at the stage that you're currently at, and have seen the problems that you're currently having. So as you're talking to board members in the VC environment, obviously if it's a board meeting scenario, whether you're in the meeting or just helping prepare, you're still going to want to present on what happened, within the quarter, and talk to, what the goals are for next quarter. But you really have the opportunity to ask for their expertise. That's what they're there for. So if you're, starting a new strategy, maybe you're moving into PLG or something along those lines, they've done it before. So kind of bring them here's what we're looking to do. Here's our plans. have you seen this work, or do you have advice for us on how to implement this in a different way?
When you say that they're there to help, I suspect it means a few different things. It's probably their network, it's being able to share their experiences, and also probably some tangible things. What are some of those resources you've been able to tap into through your investor or because of your investors?
I mean, the experience, I think, is the most important for me. Again, just having that conversation and being able to talk through, what they've seen already work. It's huge. And, you can have that conversation, whether it's around technology, whether it's around people, or whether it's around process. Again, they've been there. There's a reason they invested in your company. It's because they know your space. So have the conversation, ask the question you want to ask, because you're not going to get better advice than, from someone who's already done it.
And as you advanced and continued in your RevOps career, especially knowing that the needs of different sized companies are vastly, apart, were there resources you relied upon yourself, through or outside of the investor space that helped you continue to grow and hone your knowledge and keep basically at the cutting edge of what's happening in the industry?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in continued education. That doesn't always necessarily mean going back to school or getting the MBA, but following things like new podcasts, taking courses online. I encourage all of my ops team members to do Six Sigma. I'm a Six Sigma black belt, earned that way back in the day, and ever since. I think it's important for ops professionals to have that background, even if you're not in the traditional manufacturing space, because most people, when they hear it, that's what they think of. The applications there, I think, scale far beyond and really help create that continuous improvement mentality that you need to really succeed and excel in the ops space.
I love that. There's structured learning, like those certifications. There's unstructured learning or more everyday learning. Shout out and plug for the podcast, and please subscribe if you're listening. Great recommendations to just stay on top of that education.
What I love too about having that common experience across the team. So whether or not it's manufacturing focused, you're introducing a set of language and a set of tools that the team can now speak together, and they know when you reference something a certain way, what you're referring to, all that. So I think that's awesome. I'd love to talk to you about technology for a little bit. You've certainly seen a lot of it working across your various roles. With your most recent experience, was there one tech stack tool that you could just not live without?
Personally, a data analytics platform. That's my number one. I think you can get by in a lot of ways, with depending on where you are from a CRM perspective, marketing automation perspective. There's a lot of different tools out there that can meet your needs depending on what stage you are. You don't have to switch to the Marketo right away, when you're joining a team. You can start with some of the smaller platforms. But the one that I always want and I always need is some type of data analytics platform, be it Tableau or Domo, somewhere where I can actually create the visualizations. All of my data sources are plugged in. I'm able to transform and connect different data sources together. That's the most critical. Because when you've got team members who are spending hours, days, weeks just combing through Excel and trying to clean stuff up just to get you a basic report on, activity level metrics, you're not able to actually get any insight out of that, because all of your time and resources spent just cleaning up the data to give you a basic, okay, here's our number for this week.
And sadly, companies just wait too long to make the investment in the proper BI tools. So there are people cobbling things together on Sundays in Excel or whatever means they have.
Of course. And that's unanimous across whatever size company you're at. There's always someone who's still sitting in Excel trying to clean up a database manually and then, give you a PowerPoint of some charts.
And if you could invest in any one of those BI tools, is there one that would stand out? You mentioned a few, but I'm just curious if you could have your pick.
Tableau is my favorite. I think it's a really good starting place for any level of users, and it has a lot of good connectors right off the bat. I think I've seen a lot of organizations who are, with the Microsoft Office suite already push Power BI, but I think the learning curve there is a bit steep, especially if you have a smaller team, whereas you can get started on Tableau extremely self-serve and really kind of teach yourself or learn through, YouTube videos and the like for kind of building up that experience if you don't have it.
Sure. And there's probably more talent in the marketplace as well, if you needed to tap other talent for that.
Absolutely.
And just out of curiosity, was there a tool within your environment that you would rely on for a health check? Just like, is everything running the way that you expect it to be running, or were you able to produce that within Tableau?
Mostly, we're able to produce most of that in Tableau. Again, all of our core dashboards were built on Tableau. We're just looking at those on a daily basis, different reports for, what happened today versus the weekly versus the monthly kind of view in to see, what was going on across the business. But the other component just for your health check, you have to have a testing methodology built in. So a lot of times, especially, with MarTech, we're not talking about we're doing everything off of one platform. We may have data feeding from one to another. You've got an ad that's feeding into your automation platform, that's feeding to Salesforce. So that chain in the data has multiple points where it can break. If you're only looking at, let's say, your end dashboard, you might miss that, your point one broke somewhere. So having that kind of regular testing cadence built up in is really important. So, you've got someone on your team, they're submitting test records, you watch the test record, make sure it got all the way through, to your end system and can diagnose, when an issue may have occurred, especially when you're rolling out new changes. It's really important to do that, pre and post implementation.
There's a whole bunch of things you just said, Sam, that are really resonating with me. And selfishly, I want to ask you and to dive into some specifics. You mentioned, of course, how important the BI tool is. You mentioned the importance of being able to understand the status of different initiatives. There's so much that we use in the marketing tech stack, right? We all are familiar with the graphics where there's literally thousands of tools on a single page, and the logos are like 1 centimeter apart. When you were overseeing and trying to get the insight level, not just, hey, here's a number to tell you kind of where you are today or where you are this week, when you're trying to evaluate the data and come up with recommendations and come up with what is your opinion and perspective of how does this change certain decisions you need to make around, be that campaigns or your demand gen funnel or any kind of campaign related decision. Was there a way you were able to pull everything into a single place, a single view? What were some of those platforms? Like, for example, it's across the ad platform. It might be across your marketing operations, probably your website, maybe your personalization tool, maybe have an intent platform. Like, there's so much that we use just to function day to day. Was there an effective way where you're able to pull all of that into one place, into your BI? Or did some component of the marketing ops functions basically still rely on weekly Excel swimming about in data?
So I think the reality is there's no perfect platform. I would love to say that, yes, I was able to always get everything I needed out of Tableau. That was my closest to single source of truth as I've gotten. But the reality is you need to take that data and then pair that with knowledge of what's going on in the business. Now, I think enriching that data as much as you can, with your own kind of qualitative information, be that, specific campaigns and messagings that were being run at the time or events that happened. That's always key. But to actually get the insights, it's a bit of taking the data, looking at your peaks and valleys, and then aligning that to what happened, and then figuring out what drove that change. To think of one example, back in my career with NCR, we had a digital banking campaign that we ran. And from the activity level metrics, it looked wildly successful. We had a ton of leads that came in, so much interest. The ads were driving a ton of clicks. Looked great. But then all of the leads that came in were like almost immediately disqualified. So, that raises some red flags. And when we went back and actually talked to the sellers and the SDRs that were receiving those leads, what we found out was there was a ton of interest, but the people that were clicking on the ads and driving the interest were actually end users, not banks. So it was people who were out in the market who were frustrated with their digital banking solutions at their bank and seeing the ad and clicking it, as opposed to banks who were looking to buy new digital banking solutions.
What a challenge.
So it's, what we ended up having to do then is go back and kind of tweak the ad and the language to make sure, and the audience to make sure it was actually hitting the banks as opposed to the end users. So it's a bit of both. You have to do the numbers side, but you have to really talk to the organizations as well.
I love that you bring it back to having qualitative input. I think for someone who would have come through marketing ops and focused on the data and the reporting, it's so easy to completely rely on that and say, hey, I'm so data driven, I'm so data focused. And at the same time, just like what you said at the start of the call, sitting next to an end user, having actual conversations with humans, how strange is that, is important to having that complete picture to inform your decisions.
It is. And that's one area, at the time we were siloed marketing ops for sales ops, but that's one of those exact examples of why having the two functions together works well. Because again, if it was marketing side only, looks great. We did our job. We drove the leads. Our KPI was the lead generation. Sales is looking for opportunities. None of the leads converted to them. It was a massive failure. So having, both sides of that story, that's how you actually fix the problem.
So if we take a step back and we think about the future of RevOps for a moment, is there anything about the future of RevOps that's exciting to you or that excites you?
I think the adoption of, on the whole, and the importance of operations and how we've continued to kind of see growth in that area, that's what really excites me. I think more and more organizations will move away from the siloed approach and to that, singular revenue ops function with more buy-in from finance. So I see that trend as a positive overall. And the wealth of data that's available today, obviously there's a massive amount of platforms that we're using, as you mentioned, the stack of logos is just massive, to the point where sometimes it can be overwhelming, but I see it as opportunity. We have more information available than ever before. And there's so much we can do with that to create new and exciting ways to engage with customers.
So, Samantha, this conversation's been amazing. We'd love to shift gears now and talk about who you are a little bit, your background. So you're based in the city, but I always call it the city. You're in New York City, correct?
I'm actually in Boston. So I'm a lifelong New Yorker. We just recently moved up here about 6 months ago, but possibly some eyes on moving back.
Okay. All right. Well, that's exciting. So very cool. Now that I've said that Boston isn't the city. And did you study down University of Miami? Is that correct?
I did.
And what did you study?
actually marketing. I moved around a little bit. So started in marine biology, didn't have a stomach for it, went to architecture for a hot minute, and then ended in marketing. So that's how we're here today.
Yeah. So believe it or not, you're the second guest on this podcast that has been a RevOps leader that started in marine biology. So how cool is that? It's a small world.
It's a small world.
Yes. Yes. Let's talk a little bit about how you got into SaaS RevOps.
Yeah, so it kind of happened organically for me. I actually started my professional career, believe it or not, in communications as your, basic comms partner, editing press releases, and I was in New York City at the time, and it was at our executive office. So I happened to be, in the office to hear a lot of executive level conversations that were just happening in the halls that I wouldn't have otherwise been exposed to. And our head of communications at the time was having a lot of trouble proving the value of the work that we were doing as a team. There was just constant challenges of, I don't understand what's going on. And I went to him at a time, kind of took a risk and said, I think I can help. Can I pilot an automation and analytics program? Said, okay, sure, go ahead. So completely in-house, started sending all of our internal communications through an email marketing platform that the company had developed, and not one that was, one of the big names. Kind of coding them out myself, basic HTML, taught myself how to do it. And started putting together a couple really basic dashboards in Excel, looking at, some of our media coverage, as well as what was happening from an internal comms perspective and employee engagement. And almost immediately the whole team was like, we need more of this. For the first time, I'm able to go back to my executive and say, here's what we drove this month, for your program and your platform. So it very quickly became my full-time job, was taken off of all of the traditional comm stuff. And it was like, okay, this is all you do now. Hit critical mass of, I can't do this just by myself anymore. Went back, said, can I, bring on a couple of people to work under me? And then it was like, yes, we need more of this. And then from there, we had some org changes and, ended up doing the same thing for marketing, and the team just grew from there. So I kind of fell into it.
Oh, that's amazing. And, maybe this is a great time to ask, in an ideal world, what's next on your career bucket list?
Yeah. So, I love operations. It really, operations is it comes natural to me. I like to describe myself to most people. I'm an analytic at heart, but an ops person by nature. My dream is to one day, be a COO. So kind of continuing down that pathway and finding the right opportunity to really continue, my ops experience. That's my goal.
I think we're seeing that more and more. Heads of revenue operations are taking steps in that direction. So very excited for you, and wish you luck on that journey.
Thank you.
As you continue the journey of conquering the corporate world and conquering the C-suite, what do you do to unwind from the insanity of your role? What are the things that makes you sing, so to speak, or literally or metaphorically, outside of work?
Yeah, outside of work, I have a 4-year-old daughter, so spend a lot of family time with her. We love to cook together. She's very sassy and opinionated already, which I can't imagine where she gets that from. But yeah, just, we do a lot of family time. We dance, we sing, and yeah, it's been great.
Love it. Being able to keep the work chaos in context when you've got real things to worry about, at home with a 4-year-old, that always keeps one grounded. Along the way, you've probably run into a lot of folks who've served as mentors, served as role models, inspiration in ops. Are there people in the community that you really admire? Are there folks you want to shout out to? Who else do you think should be on the podcast?
One person comes to mind for sure. His name is Jim Lenskold. Years ago, back in my NCR days, we worked together in a contract capacity. And having that time with him, he really taught me a lot of different ways to look at ROI and how to model out ROI, especially, from the upfront, from the, the leading indicators on the marketing side, all the way through to revenue. So I definitely think he's someone who could be very helpful, on this podcast for sure. And then in terms of other mentors, I've been very fortunate in that I've gotten to work for a ton of really inspirational female leaders that helped me, personally and professionally, kind of, dealing with, how to approach, the workforce and be a woman in tech. So Maria Zivanovic-Smith, obviously one of them. I've learned so much from her, and then Meredith as well. From my days at Stratified, working with both of them really was great.
Fantastic. And it's so amazing to be able to help lift each other up in the process and help bring other people along, right, as we progress in our careers.
Absolutely.
We'll make sure to include their LinkedIn profiles in case other people are interested in following them. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
So where can people find you? Are you on social media these days, or LinkedIn?
Yes, I am on LinkedIn, and I will be glad to share that link as well.
Okay.
But other than that, I'm pretty quiet on social media.
Understood. Well, Sam, this has been an amazing past hour together. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your RevOps experiences with our listeners. It's really just been a pleasure, and we're so excited to hear what your next steps are as you work into 2023. We really wish you all the luck and appreciate your time together with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed our conversation. And for everyone listening, please subscribe. Great podcast to listen to, especially if you're in the ops space.
Thanks for the plug, Sam. You did my job for me. Of course, we're very grateful for everyone listening, appreciative of the increased excitement and enthusiasm we're getting all over social media whenever a new podcast episode drops. So if you learned something today, do what Samantha just mentioned. Tell someone about the podcast and please subscribe. Thank you again for being on the podcast, Sam.
Thank you.
And this has been another exciting, insightful episode of RevOps Rockstars. See you next time.
Stay classy, Rockstars. And that wraps up another episode. Thank you so much for joining us. For show notes and other episodes, visit RevOpsRockstars.com. RevOps Rockstars is sponsored by OpFocus. Visit opfocus.com to learn more about how OpFocus helps SaaS companies scale their revenue operations.